Anticipation, pressing urgently against the silence, surrounded the figures of Jimmy Bradley and his assailant, framing them in a holy, luminous glow, the kind of aura that forms when the expectation of bloodshed and possible death inhabits without warning. There was one person in the bar who claimed Jimmy as a dear friend, and because that meant everything honorable to him, he was ready to risk his own life to see to it that no harm befell Jimmy Bradley. That person was my father. Before the bottle-wielding man could render Jimmy's face into bloody raw meat or sever his jugular vein, my father flashed across the room to the bar. Grabbing the man's arm at the wrist, he twisted and sent the broken bottle shattering to the floor. A fistfight ensued as the drunkard turned his rage toward my father. It was over quickly, the man bloodied and out cold amidst the toppled bar stools. While Jimmy called the police, the crowd erupted into cheers and began slapping my father on the back. My father made his way through the relieved and rejoicing patrons and returned to our table, pulling a Camel from his pack and lighting up, smiling and shrugging his shoulders in gestures that seemed to say, it was nothing. Suddenly, my eyes widened with the shock of what I saw. Spreading from the top button of his shirt downward near to his belt buckle and radiating out toward his armpits of his white shirt, stained with an enormous swath of glistening blood. I was unable to move or speak or cry. I was simultaneously captivated and frightened, even when my mother reassured me that my father was okay, that it was not his blood. Still, I stared transfixed. Somehow I knew instinctively that my father did something good that night, that standing up for the underdog, stood up for the underdog, stepping up for what's right, even at the risk to oneself, comes wrapped in nobility and sometimes in blood. I imagine the statues of the wounded soldiers in Mitchell Square Park, aiding one another. Like them, here was my father standing heroically in front of me, the image of his bloodied shirt billowing through the chambers of my young heart. I wanted so much to be like him. It was mere months later when the entire heroic edifice I had constructed and placed my father atop of came crashing down. Already in his mid-50s and suffering relentless pain from his back injury, my father had begun working on the docks less and less. He was aimless and angry. As a result, he began drinking more and more, leaving my mother at home to tend to me and my sister. As my mother explained it years later, his nightly arrival at the apartment from Bradley's bar began to grow increasingly tense between them. When my father began to physically lash out, my mother began fearing that my sister and I would eventually become targets of his rage. At that point, two of her strongest instincts collided. Her deep-seated impulse to do anything to protect her children smashed headlong into the profound love that filled her for the only man she had ever been with, the only man she ever loved. From within the wreckage of her heart, amidst the debris of a life unexpectedly overturned by capricious, inebriated fate, my mother knew what had to be done, and she moved decisively. It was an incongruously beautiful spring day when my mother's brother-in-law, my Uncle Chuck, appeared in front of our apartment with a small truck to take us away from my father. Just like that, without any real warning, much less understanding on the part of my sister and I, our world in Washington Heights came to a sudden and definitive end. There was no conversation to break the awkward tension. Only the matter-of-fact movements of packing up one life in the hopes of finding a better one elsewhere. It was something my father did over 25 years earlier when he left Ireland. Now, the legacy of leaving, of fleeing really, was being passed to the next generation. There was hardly anything to load onto the truck. A small bed, a chest of drawers, some bags of clothes, and more bags filled with the few toys we had. It was stifling and eerily silent, as if an oxygen-deprived vacuum suddenly enveloped me. All I remember is my father standing on the sidewalk at the foot of those steep steps that led up to the front of our building. His black wavy hair hung just above his eyebrows, a pack of Camels in his pocket of his white shirt. He simply stood and stared as Uncle Chuck closed the back of the truck and we all loaded into the front seat. Me against the passenger door so I could look out the window, my sister on my mother's lap in the middle. I watched my father as he drove away. He never moved. He didn't even light up a cigarette. As we began our 5-mile sojourn to the Bronx, an oddly short distance between vastly distant worlds, my mind and heart was stricken with sadness, confusion, and shock. My father, my hero, was not coming with us. For the life of me, I couldn't tell if we were leaving him or he was leaving us. The answer to that question would shape-shift throughout the course of my life in the Bronx, as I wrestled the twin demons of desperately loving my father and hating him with equal passion.
Winter's day in a deep and dark December, I am alone, hiding in my room, safe within my room. I touch no one, no one touches me. I am a rock, I am my own, and a rock feels no pain, and an island never dies.
So the next transition was entering PS 95. In many ways, I feel like I came to our neighborhood as sort of this feral bar kid, trying to figure out, how to navigate social graces, which were lacking. I remember the first day, it was like one of the first or second days I walked to PS 95 from Saxon with my mom. And nobody was in school. Except me and like 3 other people. And I'm like, what's going on here? Oh, it's the high holy days. It's Rosh Hashanah. It's Yom Kippur. Schools are closed. Schools are closed for them, but not for you. So I spent the whole day taking 3 cartons of milk all around the building. It was very strange. I have Mrs. Talker in first grade. Who remembers? Yeah, quite a character. And for me, she was a very loving soul. And I had an episode that I want to share with you that marked another important transition for me, becoming acclimated and slowly adjusted to being in a Jewish neighborhood in the Bronx. I drew a Nazi swastika on the sole of my shoe as I sat bored in class. I'd seen this symbol a lot in my house and had drawn it plenty of times, inspired by my cousin's fascination with building plastic models of German World War II weapons. From Luftwaffe planes to Panzer tanks to a huge model of the battleship Bismarck, always in gray plastic. My cousin seemed more fascinated by the German army than the American, though they still built plenty of green plastic replicas of US weaponry. Yet they seemed more compelled by the imagery and symbolism of iron crosses, lightning bolts signifying blitzkrieg, and drawing the fearsome swastika. At the time I drew it on my shoe, I had no idea what it really meant, or what it would stir up. Within an instant of its completion, a girl sitting in the row next to me raised her hand and blurted out, Mrs. Tucker, Tommy drew a swastika on his shoe." The entire class gulped a breath in unison and turned toward me. Whatever Mrs. Tucker did next was going to determine whether or not they peacefully released that collective inhale, and how they would treat me thereafter. Without hesitation, she called me to the front of the classroom. The rest of the students began breathing again, slowly with anticipation, their heads turning to follow my sullen march toward her desk. I could feel the tension in the air, and a rising, nameless dread oozing throughout my body. As I stood facing the class, Mrs. Talker began by explaining that the Nazi swastika was a horrible symbol, that it stood for the killing of millions of Jews. Jews just like my classmates. Now the dread I was experiencing was replaced by a distinctive and familiar sense of shame. Tears beaded along my lower eyelids. Mrs. Talker, in a voice both measured and without anger, continued to make it clear that I was never to draw this symbol again, that it was hurtful to all the students who were my neighbors and friends. I told her in the class that I was sorry, and I promised that I would never ever draw the swastika. She nodded her head, signaling that the matter was over, and asked me to return to my desk. I was quiet for the rest of the school day and found myself alone more often than not. My classmates perhaps responding to some unspoken pariah status that had been either conveyed to the entire group as a result of what I had done, or self-adopted as my way of expressing contrition, or some combination of the two. This was my first lesson in the nightmare that Jewish people throughout Germany, Europe, and Eastern Europe had been thrust into by virtue of simply being Jews. I was rallied, and in that moment in front of the class, I made a silent, sacred vow to never allow myself to do anything like that again with respect to my Jewish friends. Anti-Semitism, even with my rudimentary understanding, instantly became painful and repugnantly anathema to me.
I hear a red door and I want it to turn black. No colors anymore, I want them to turn black. I see the dead go by, they in summer clothes.